Good morning. Welcome to Carrying Conversations podcast. This is episode 14. It's a good episode, definitely something that we need to talk about more and more often and have part of regular conversations. Today, we're talking about what happens behind closed doors, recognizing and responding to elder abuse at home. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Rose Judy, one of Canada's leading voices on elder abuse and aging in diverse communities. She's going to talk about what elder abuse looks like inside the home and just provide some clarity on some of the barriers to that reporting of elder abuse and also how it affects different communities around our environment. So, welcome, Dr. Judy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, if you don't mind, could you provide just a brief explanation of what your work is and how you're an advocate for our aging population?
Absolutely. I think really the most important thing about talking about this topic is that it's not one of the most exciting ones for some people, I guess, when it comes to addressing the important and sensitive issues, especially around mistreatment of older people. But it is definitely one that I've been very passionate about, mostly as I've been working with a lot of older people, especially from diverse populations, where other things such as their immigration experiences and language barriers could be preventing them from living a quality of life that they'd actually deserve. And so the work that I do really encompasses more of that awareness and education, and providing not for profit, but also provincial organizations and entities, I guess, information about how to. Um, I guess, point out to them how they could identify something as sensitive as elder abuse, but also how to advocate for better supports for older people too when it comes to that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Sorry, I should say that your title is currently the Director of Gender Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Help Age Canada. I had a chance to check out the website today. Fantastic work that everyone is doing there. And I understand that there is your big annual workshop meeting coming up soon as well. So that's very exciting. I think it aligns pretty closely with our world recognition of elder abuse in June. Is that correct?
So we do have our summit, actually. Yes. So I think you were
Yes.
mentioning the summit. We are, yes, hosting it 7th of June, actually, in Winnipeg. And so it is an opportunity for what we do at HelpAge, which is supporting community-based senior serving organizations Canada-wide in doing the best that they can do, but also supporting them to continue doing the work that they're doing and bringing all of those organizations together to have conversations about how to promote the quality of life and well-being of older people in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And a much needed topic of conversation, right? Your specific niche related to elder abuse in dynamic populations, I think is really important to discuss and open the conversation to because it happens to be one of the most underreported and misunderstood issues affecting older adults in Canada. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So we call it a silenced epidemic, really, because it's one of those experiences that happen and we know it occurs. However, there's a struggle and a challenge finding out the real numbers and the stats because people do not feel comfortable talking about the uncomfortable topics, though it's a very important one, of course. And I wouldn't be surprised to know if the numbers are quite high or that it's on the rise in various ways because of the growing number of older people and the various factors that really, I guess, enhance the likelihood of it happening as well.
For sure. I think it's a very complex topic to discuss. It involves family members, it involves the general public, it involves different cultures and different types of abuse too. Do you want to just chat with us about what are the different types of elder abuse?
Yeah, I also wanted to emphasize that love and harm can actually coexist together, and that's the
Hmm.
unfortunate reality. And there is absolutely no excuse for mistreating or abusing or neglecting any person, let alone an older adult. Yet sometimes there's an overlap between stress and abuse or mistreatment sometimes. Though, again, I don't want to say that all stressed people will abuse older adults, but the whole idea of stress and lack of support and lack of resources, and sometimes really just lack of knowledge about what's out there can lead to burnout, but also can lead to behavior that can be very detrimental to the older person. And when it comes to elder abuse in particular, we're actually now currently calling it the mistreatment of older people, according to the reports from the Government of Canada, but also the World Health Organization as well. And the reason behind that is because the term elder abuse in itself is quite a scary term and a word that really at times prevents conversations from moving forward. And so calling it the mistreatment of older people, we're not really sugarcoating it, but we're trying to encompass all things that could lead to the mistreatment of an older person, whether it's intentional or unintentional, and the
Hmm.
variety of kinds of elder abuse that could really happen. But, elder abuse is a term that we could still use. It's one that people identify with in particular. I mean, the narrative sometimes really has to adapt and change to the needs of the population that you're talking to.
Hmm. For sure. So mistreatment of elders, I think it's a pretty broad term, and I actually really like that they've changed it because of the negative connotations that come with the term abuse and, relating abuse to family, and how I can definitely see how that would stall out conversations when you start broaching that. As a health professional, it becomes very scary when people start talking about abuse and what are the repercussions of that. So I think, the mistreatment, I definitely like how broad that can be, because we definitely think of abuse as physical harm, right? But, there's many different types of mistreatment of elder people in our community.
100%. I think when people hear elder abuse, they immediately think physical abuse. And that is the most obvious, I guess, when you're looking at it. Yet, in fact, what we're finding from stats currently is that there are other forms of older adult mistreatment, the more hidden and subtle ones,
Sure.
such as financial abuse and emotional and psychological abuse as well. So those are the two kinds of abuse that actually, since 2020 during COVID lockdowns, seem to be on the rise. Again, it's because it's not the typical kind of abuse that we think about, such as physical, where you might see signs of physical, um, um, I guess, mistreatment of an older person in a sense of bruises or cuts, etc. You're thinking more about what are the things that we can't see, yet the person could be actually to be taken advantage of, their finances, their bank accounts. Unless you actually have access to those things, you won't be sometimes able to see that. Yet, if you see the person being neglected in terms of how, are they clothed properly? Are they fed? Do they look like they're losing weight? Purchasing food, for example, or knowing that they have a particular income, yet they don't seem to be living the life based on that income. In fact, a lower standard of living. And so those are the things that are subtle. And then, of course, the emotional component, psychological component. Do they look uncomfortable in the presence of a particular person? Do they seem more, not at ease or a bit anxious or hesitant to talk or not lifting their eyes or, other body language signs that sometimes could be an indicator that a person is not doing well in the presence of that particular individual. And so those are the things that I think it's also very important for us to think about. It's not just the things that we see, it's the other subtle things that we don't see that could be an indicator that the person is being mistreated.
For sure. And I think when you say could, that's an important piece to address too, right? Because there are so many different cultural contexts right now, well, always, but we're seeing aging cultures in all different communities, and those behaviors may appear different as a result of that cultural context. Can you speak to that?
Yes, and thank you so much for picking on that. And I think
Hmm.
it's always important for me to highlight that culture in itself is not a reason for people to experience elder abuse. And so even though a person might come from a different cultural background, it doesn't mean that necessarily it's their culture that is causing this. And it's very important for us to not overgeneralize because in some cultures, the lowering of the gaze, for example, is actually a sign of respect. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is afraid of
Hmm.
an individual, etc. Or it could be that in some cultures, the oldest adult child is the one who is now more of the not just the provider, but the person who takes care of the family as such. And so
Hmm.
they're the person who is more likely to speak as opposed to the parent. And so it's
Hmm.
very important when we're looking at healthcare professionals, but also any other individual that enters the life of an older person from an ethnically diverse background, is to be more aware of the cultural components that
Hmm.
plays a role in how this person interacts. And I think that's a very key point that I try to stress when I do talk to, whether it's not-for-profit organizations or where we're talking to provincial government or even, the police, for example, is that it's very important to have that cultural humility and cultural understanding component so we can be able to have those conversations in ways where we're not jumping to conclusions fast enough, but also
Hmm.
I'm picking up on some signs that could be an indicator that something's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And very challenging, for those of us that are on the front lines and, uh, providing care or interacting with the community and trying to be educated, culturally sensitive, but also having those spidey senses that, want to alert us to something's off here and the nuances of those relationships. It becomes very challenging. You have done a lot of research specifically on elder abuse through the ethnocultural lens. What did your research lead you to find?
It was such an interesting and I guess I want to say exciting because there were things that we were able to pick up from that project that really led to us to get a better understanding of how we can approach this topic for particular groups of people that usually tend to be underrepresented when it comes to these things. And the
Hmm.
reason behind that is that we know that the reporting of elder abuse is quite low compared to the potential projected experiences of elder abuse. But it's also almost non-existent in terms of stats for people who are from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So even when we know that, let's say, 1 in every 6 older people over 65 report being abused, stats from Stats Canada doesn't really tell us what the ethnic background of the people are. And the reason behind that is when you're looking at ethnically diverse populations, immigrants, newcomers, for example, especially as they're coming from linguistically, spiritually, culturally diverse backgrounds, the dynamics, the family dynamics plays a huge role in how they interact and how they perceive and how they talk about particular topics, especially sensitive ones. In many cases, an older person, and this goes for the ethnic and the non ethnic, I want to say, individuals, in many cases, it's the older adult child that is potentially causing the harm to an adult or a family member that the older person is dependent on and relies on. So you can imagine, for example, if that's language dependency, if that's financial dependency, if that's social dependency, then the factors here play a role against the person being more independent and therefore more relying on the adult child. And those are factors that we really have to point out. The more dependent an older adult is on a person in particular, the more likely that older adult may be taken advantage of as a result. It's not a blanket kind of case, but it's something to kind of pinpoint. And that's why it's important to promote independence of older people. When the older person is a fear of losing a family member because of reporting elder abuse, we're seeing that in some of our findings, for example, from this project. There's this fear of authority that some ethnic groups may have, and that prevents them from reporting mistreatment. There's the lack of knowledge of what's going to happen if I do report it to this person who's my
Hmm.
family member, but also to myself as an older person who depends on this individual. So sometimes
Hmm.
an adult is far more likely to risk their own safety than to risk the unknown of what's going to happen to them or the family member that is mistreating them.
Hmm.
So those are the things that really came out in some of the findings from the research.
Interesting. And I suspect that, multi-generational housing, having multi-generations live under one roof just complicates things even further.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the dependence, right? I would
Hmm.
talk to some ethnic community members and I would say, what would the what would one of the reasons be, or one of the main reasons that would you share with us that would prevent a person from reporting a mistreatment? And in addition, of course, to, well, this is my son or this is my family
Mhm.
member. How can I do that to them? And the shame that may bring to me and my family and the community will start talking, for example. Not all of people, would mention these things, but there is that concern about reputation and pride, but also it's what's going to happen to me. I'm brought here by my adult child. I live under their roof, especially if they don't have access to any form of support or benefit for older people yet. Right, because they haven't been long enough in Canada, that financial dependency is huge. And so they would say to
Mhm.
me, if we were to report it, would you provide me with accommodation? Would the government provide me with financial assistance and support? And if the answer is no, then I'm not going to report it because at least I have a roof under my head and food on the table.
Yeah, exactly. That becomes very complex and scary for that individual for sure. I mean, so much is hanging on that. I know we have talked about family being, potentially part of that harm. What does external, outside of the family, what does that type of abuse and neglect or mistreatment look like?
So are we talking about, if it was in outside environments outside of the household?
Yeah, not a family member that was causing this sort of mistreatment.
I
How
think
do you see that sort of?
it's quite interesting because, I mean, if we're really I guess, talking about ethnically diverse communities, um, I don't want to overgeneralize, but some of them might be in the, I guess, presence of or being supported and looked after by a family member. And usually that family member may be the main caregiver, which in itself might be a challenge, of course, and a cause for concern, especially if there's a lack of understanding what supports could be available to that caregiver to do their best job. Many of the families that I talked with who come from ethnically diverse backgrounds would not likely seek the support and assistance of someone outside of the family or the community. And that is because of their, I guess, some of the concerns would be the language barriers. You'd need to find someone who speaks their language to be able to understand them, or maybe their religious or spiritual backgrounds to be able to support and respect that. But also it's sometimes it's that lack of compatibility of what are the resources and supports outside of the community that could actually align with the needs of this older person. So when I do talk to ethnic communities, it's really more about what can be done for us as an ethnic community so we can support our older adults, family members or parents, as opposed to, is there someone from the outside that we can bring inside?
Okay. And how does mistreatment of elders typically get identified? Who is the one reporting this typically, and what does that reporting process look like?
It's usually obviously someone, I don't want to say outside the family because it could be sometimes a member from the family that's reporting this.
Mhm.
But it most likely, in some cases, could be a community member that is concerned about the older person, whether it's a friend, a neighbor that they spoke with, maybe confided to, maybe talked to, and just tried to get some things off their chest, for example. So it'd be their concern that would then be almost like a red flag that may require some form of assistance and support to the older person. Now, with that being said, we have various organizations for immigrants and newcomers, especially here in Calgary, but in the province as well. And sometimes those older adults seek support from those organizations, whether it's the financial support, whether it's social support. And at times, when you have a trained social worker or community connector or even a caregiver, for example, that could be outside of the family, that or a healthcare professional that comes in every now and then to check in on that older person, they
Mhm.
may be cognizant and see things that could be potential concerns that then they could report to people from the outside. But unfortunately, sometimes it's rarely the older person who's being mistreated that speaks up.
What are some of the most common warning signs that people should be watching for when interacting with these seniors in the community?
I think it's really important to be mindful of the cultural background, like I said, of these individuals and what is considered a cultural norm in terms of their behaviors versus what is something that you should be concerned of. And that's why a lot of cultural humility and compassion training is very important. But with that being said, for example, if you are a healthcare professional that's going into the environment of the older person, and pay attention to things like I said of, are they usually the ones that voice their concerns or the ones that are speaking up or having conversations? In the presence of an individual, do they seem more intimidated? Do they seem more quiet than usually?
Hmm.
Um, and I would say things like, are they losing weight, for example? And could that be,
Hmm.
in addition to this, physical health changes that could be occurring? And we're ruling some of those out. Is it because they're
Okay.
not being or eating enough, I guess? And, other signs like, how are they being dressed, for example?
Hmm.
Being dressed for the environment? Are they being dressed in ways that seem to be ways that they're being looked after?
Do you have any recommendations for agencies or people of the general public on how to educate themselves on recognizing elder abuse or mistreatment of seniors?
I mean, the training that I provided as a result of the project, I guess, really helped promote and bring to light the importance of being culturally, cultural humility and cultural compassion as well. And I pause sometimes when I say those words because the term that we used to hear a lot is cultural competence, which is a term that I actually don't use anymore and I don't prefer using because competency means you figured everything out about the culture and you're
Right.
good to go. And we can never be competent in any culture, ours included. So we're always in the learning process. And so humility means being mindful of the fact that other cultures are different than yours. And we respect that. And we ask with respect and curiosity about that person's culture. And there's no shame really in asking and saying, I don't know a lot about your culture, but I'm willing to learn and I'd like to know. And that helps a lot because what that's doing is that's gradually building trust with this community by saying we're not coming in assuming we know everything for you because it's not about what we know what's best for you. It's about what you're going to share with us, hopefully, to let us know what is best for you by having this mutual conversation. And usually, we're also going in with this idea of the asking, you know. Especially with older adult mistreatment, for example, it's important for us to not go saying elder abuse and then translating it from English to their language, because what makes sense to us in English may not make sense to other people in their languages and it comes across as very disrespectful. So my ask would be in English, this is the term that we use. What is the equivalent in your language? And then you continue using that. And same goes for caregiver, for example. The word caregiver in English translated to other languages actually means a person who is not a family member who's getting paid to do what they're doing. And so we can't really use the word caregiver in some languages and cultures because I have actually had people say it's very disrespectful because what we use in my culture is the daughter, the son-in-law, etc. So they use family terminologies as opposed to caregiver, which comes across as a paid straight.
Interesting. That's new to me, so I think that's very fascinating. Definitely speaks to my cultural humility and always wanting to learn how to be more culturally sensitive. Yeah, I think it's again, I've said complex, but I think that it's not even a fair word to say complex because there's so many nuances to what is happening behind closed doors when there's family involved, when there's an older adult involved. And then you add something as challenging as capacity and consent and what all of that looks like. A little bit off script, but can you speak to how that also plays into this?
Yes, I think that's a really important topic, especially when it comes to language barriers and
Hmm.
the potential lack of ability of the older person from fully being able to give consent if they don't actually understand what they're consenting
Hmm.
for, and having a family member who's a translator and interpreter and the person who's doing the sign-offs for them sometimes. This goes for the same thing for example, when we talk to police, for example, and we talk about having consent of older adults, etc., or family members being the translators and interpreters, which I don't recommend in most cases. However,
Hmm.
sometimes that's what's available, right? And so I think having those private conversations with the older person is very important. But clarifying that in order for us to move forward with a particular resource or support, we need you to approve of this. And having it translated into their language or a language that they speak is very helpful, as opposed to just providing it in English, because then that way they can hopefully read it and not rely on the family member to do it. And I also wanted to stress that sometimes we come across older adults who are illiterate in their own language. And so they don't read or write their own language. And so providing them with the written documents doesn't actually make any sense to them. And so what I would recommend in that case is audio or recorded information, whether it's information or consent information, and to be able to verbally take their consent as a result of that verbal passing on of information. And so
Mhm.
it's a very tricky, as you said, Melissa, it's very tricky. It is actually really complex. It's okay for us to use that because there are so many intersecting
Mhm.
factors. It's not very easy, and it's not easy to identify, but it's not also easy to figure out. And I don't want to say fix, because I don't necessarily think that these things necessarily can be fixed, but to figure out what is the best um, what is the best thing that we can do for this adult right now in the moment? And I stress
Mhm.
that a lot because so many people say, well, we need to take them out from this environment because it's mistreating them or abusing them, and put them somewhere safer or take them to a shelter. I always say we really need to pause, because is the older person giving consent to do that, first and foremost? And second of all, what is that going to do to that older person psychologically and emotionally? So, aside from the physical aspects, um, is, plucking them out from their current environment that they know and trust to an extent, or feel comfortable with to an extent, plucking them out and putting them somewhere where they don't know anybody and no one knows them and no one speaks their language or understands their cultural background, is that going to be the right thing for us to do? So that's why when we create safety plans for older adults, they're always plans that are always changing because of the complexity of the situation. What is going to work right now? How can I keep them safe right now? And then we figure out the next steps as they evolve.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Right now is very applicable because things change, right? The dynamics of the relationship change. That abuse or mistreatment could change as a result of someone just even bringing it up and being like, "Oh, I recognize that I'm stressed and maybe this is resulting in mistreatment, unintentional, right? But now you've brought it to my attention and this is going to change how I'm behaving, or I've acknowledged this."
Absolutely. And I think like we, the conversation and the way that we're flowing with the conversation, I guess, is that it's very important to understand what are the needs of the older person right now, and to ask them what they need from us right now, as opposed to kind of jumping into that. I sometimes I call it the that's that hero complexity that sometimes that we
Mhm.
have, that we want to go in, swoop in, and take care of them and fix everything for them, when in fact we need to really pause and say, what is it that they need from us? And how can we continue keeping them safe despite the things that are happening?
Yeah, because we certainly don't want to add to the loved one's stresses, the family stresses, the client themselves, the elder, the senior themselves, and add to all of that, because that becomes almost, a form of abuse in trying to help, which, I think many people think they're trying to help, right?
It
But
Yeah,
it
it's
adds to it.
isolation, really. It's what
Yeah.
we're doing sometimes is isolating the older person from
Hmm.
their community, from their environment that they're familiar with. And there have been some cases in which that isolation, let's say taking them to a shelter or a safe place, has resulted in the older person feeling very isolated and lonely in those
Hmm.
safe places, and then eventually going back to the place that was mistreating them, but it's a familiar place for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so scary. I mean, yeah, so many different layers of how to support. But I think it's support in the way that suits the person individually best in that moment. I think that's a very key takeaway for me. Just back to the consent piece. I know that we share with our teams that no one ever loses the right to consent or refuse care. To me, that's, everyone has the right to refuse, everyone has the right to live at risk, provided the education and the resources have been presented. And even someone who lacks the capacity, has been deemed to lack capacity to no longer consent, still has the right to say, no, I am not going to shower right now. And no one is going to force them to do that. But that's a fine line when you're looking at primary caregivers and life needs to happen. People need to be cared for. Family members, we're cruelest to the ones that we love the most, and they often take some of that abuse from their loved ones that they're caring for. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know what the end result is or what the fix is, but how do you coach families in recognizing this and trying to support families in going through this, each other, trying to support each other going through this?
Yeah, I think like you were mentioning that consent is something that is quite interesting because in some cases we do want to ask what their needs are and to respect that, but at the same time things have to keep on going, I guess, and things move
Hmm.
forward. And the interesting thing about some generations or particular groups of people is that they may come from a background or an upbringing in which authority, whether it's healthcare or not, you don't argue with them. If they say you have to shower, you have to shower. So there's no give and take in that conversation. And some older people who may lack the language and the ability to express what they really want to do or feel embarrassed to say they don't understand what you're asking them to do may go along with what you're asking them to do or may not speak up and advocate for themselves. And so it's really like I said, it's really important to understand what is the level of capacity and communication that this person has. Do they need an interpreter and translator to assist them in making decisions for themselves? Do they understand that they have the ability to refuse and reject, for example, requests? And, what are the consequences? I've had people, for example, who suggested that if we don't agree or approve of the ask, the belief was that that service and support will be taken away from them, for example. Right. And so there's that hesitation of actually speaking up and saying, I actually don't want to shower right now, of the concern that because of that language barrier and the inability to express, that then they won't come back to shower me, for example. And so I'm just going to go ahead with them asking me what to do right now. So
Hmm. I think that's a real fear, though, honestly. In my experience, if they say no, that's like, okay, well, then they've refused, and that's all there is to it, which ultimately becomes a form of neglect if, us as a community are not providing the necessary services to these seniors. We are then responsible for not going back and checking in and reapproaching. That's neglectful, in my opinion.
absolutely. And the topic of neglect is quite also a very interesting and sensitive one because I've had family members approach me after talking about what elder abuse is from a Western concept. And I mentioned the word neglect in there
Hmm.
and it's related to their language. Some of them may come up to me and say things like, you know, so I forgot to, pick up medications for my parent, or I forgot a very important medical appointment for them, or I was so frustrated that even after they were calling out for my name, I had so much, stress that I didn't respond to them. And am I abusing my older adult parent
Mm.
or family member? And it's so important to highlight that there is something called, in addition to the fact that we clarify there's intentional and unintentional neglect, and that sometimes people behave in ways despite the fact that there's absolutely no excuse for abuse, but there are some people may behave in ways that they're not intentionally wanting to harm their family member, but there are other factors that might make life a bit more exasperating for them or stressful for them. So it's really important to speak about this topic with compassion and empathy and understanding, and not point out everything that's going wrong in a situation like this, but to also highlight what can we do to support people? What can we do to help people who really genuinely want to be really good family members or caregivers? But maybe they don't know where to go. They don't know who to ask. They don't know what's available to them. So I think there's a balance between us pointing the finger at people or communities and saying, you're not really doing a good job looking after your older adults. And then looking back and saying objectively, are we actually providing enough outreach and information that is
Hmm.
compatible to the community that actually helps them do better at what they're genuinely wanting to do better at?
Yeah, absolutely. Are we setting people in the community up for success to be caregivers or caring family members? Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's so important to note. have we provided people with the resources to understand and avoid this, right?
Absolutely. And I think, when you look at the topic of elder abuse, it's usually been a shaming kind of conversation, unfortunately, right? And that's why sometimes people don't feel comfortable having this conversation. That's why in the project that I did, another highlight really was that words do matter and they have huge power sometimes, that they can open doors to conversations and have really constructive conversations, or they can completely close the door and people go, oh, no, we don't abuse our older adults and we don't really want to have this conversation with you. And so what I tried to do is, after explaining what the concept of elder abuse or mistreatment is from an English or Western perspective, I go back to the community and say, in your culture, when your friend is talking to you about a particular thing that's happening in their family dynamics where they may be uncomfortable or they may not be treated in the best way possible culturally, what words do they use? How do you talk about this experience? And so a lot of them actually said that we don't call it elder abuse, we call it disrespect. We call it mistreatment, for example. And so that's why I said language matters. Going back to them and saying, this is what we call it, this is what it is in our Western framework or perspective. What is it like in your culture? And how do you talk about it in your language? And then using those particular words and hopefully looking at it from their lens in particular. And so even when we look at the kinds of elder abuse in, from the Western perspective, according to the World Health Organization, they talk about financial and physical. They talk about psychological, and they talk about medical and neglect. Cultural communities, and sexual, by the way, cultural communities, on the other hand, they mostly identify with cultural abuse, spiritual or religious abuse, in addition to the psychological abuse as well and neglect. They rarely talked about sexual abuse. And I think that's still a taboo in their culture, and that's probably why they don't have those conversations. But the psychological, cultural, spiritual forms of abuse seem to be highlighted in ethnic cultures more so than in non-ethnic cultures. And so even being aware of, that abuse itself looks different based on the group that you're talking to is very important.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it speaks to building that relationship, not just with your client, but also with the family. Excuse me. And you mentioned seeing something from their lens. So being able to look at what pressures are put on that primary caregiver, be that family member or someone outside of the family, and appreciating what they are contending with, not excusing, but taking, a different perspective and looking at what is causing this behavior potentially and how we can support them. Supporting the senior, absolutely, but also supporting the family member that maybe is dealing with grief and other financial stresses themselves and why this is all happening. It's that big picture, that full circle, holistic care piece.
100%. And I think when you look at some groups, that's really what they highlighted, Melissa, is that we don't want a solution or a form of support just for us. What are you going to do for our family members? So, and that's because in most ethnic communities, or most families in which the family dynamics and the role of family is very important to the individual, whether it's for their quality of life or well-being, we can't separate them. We can't say we're just going to support you as an older person, and yet the factors that are created that are causing this family member from abusing or mistreating you, we're just going to ignore that right now. Many older
Right.
people who depend on that family member, who want to continue to live with that family member, will usually reject and refuse assistance and support that is only for them, and say, I will only accept your support. I will only move forward if you actually provide my family member with the support that they need, because I know that they are good people, or they're kind. Yet the various factors or various experiences, whether it's addiction, whether it's financial stressors, whether it's social or psychological or mental health stressors, all those things that could be factors that are causing this individual to mistreat the older person, they
Hmm.
also need to be supported. We can't
Yeah,
separate
agree.
them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, yeah, and I think the black and white cases are becoming less and less, where it's very easy to determine and understand that this abuse is happening and we can separate them. And it's fixed. I just don't think that exists anymore in our communities with the different cultures that are present and with all of the stressors that we have in life these days. I just don't think that black and white, you know, mom has a bruise. I know who did it. This is easy kind of thing. I just don't think it happens that way anymore. Sorry, I shouldn't say it doesn't happen that way, but I think the dynamics of what that looks like are changing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah. So if someone who's listening right now is suspecting that they have an elder in their community that's being abused or neglected, what's the first thing that you recommend that they do?
Regular check-ins, I would say. I
Okay.
think this is one of the important and most basic steps that sometimes we miss out on. Isolation could be a factor in which a person could be mistreated and neglected and no one can see it. When you can't see an older person, you don't know what's happening in their lives. And so sometimes actually, that's why cases of elder abuse was on the rise during the pandemic and during lockdown, because we prevented people from going to visit people or checking in on them, especially older adults in isolated rural or remote areas of the province, for example, or the country. Now, with that being said, like I said, I think regular check ins are very important. It could be a knock on the door, it could be I just wanted to, I haven't seen you for a while. Sometimes it's also the people who aren't necessarily part of the direct circle of the older adult that really sometimes realize that there's something a bit off. For example, the local grocery store that you usually go to, the pharmacy, for example, that you go to, the library that you go to, if they don't see a person coming in as often as they usually do, or if they see something a bit off about their mannerisms or something about them from the outward kind of look, then maybe that is a potential opportunity to go and check in on that person. In addition to that, of course, we have various resources that I think you'll be sharing with the listeners as well, where
Hmm.
it comes to phone lines, for example, websites and information like that. We have, for example, here in Calgary, the Way In Network, where the number is 403 seniors, and that's basically connected to 211, where an older person or an advocate or a family member can call this line and ask for support, ask for resources, ask for information, report something that they're concerned about, and then they will link them to the right places and the right people.
Hmm. I can imagine that first phone call is very challenging for the general public. We have post COVID, especially, we have bubbles that we live in, where we don't get involved in other people's business. And taking the initiative to make a report, suspecting that there is possible elder abuse or neglect, what does that reporting process look like? And what support is there in place for that person reporting as well?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the reported component, that's why we don't really have large numbers about these,
Hmm.
incidents. It's because, like you said, it's a very sensitive one. When we're speaking about ethnically diverse people, usually what happens in the community and family stays in the community or family. And so there's no outward reporting too. So the numbers are going to, like I said, be almost non existent. But you're
Hmm.
right, it does take courage for older people to or their family members to speak up about what's happening to them. And the reality is all of these, I think it's a reality, but also sometimes it's not very obvious, is that these conversations are always confidential and they're private between the person that is reporting or calling and between the person who's receiving that call. The person who's receiving the phone calls are usually trained individuals who know how to handle these conversations. Sometimes they're social workers as well that are able to navigate these difficult conversations in ways that make it a bit more comforting and supportive. And the process is that, sometimes it could be that I'm concerned that something is off. Is there a way where we can check on this? Is there someone that you can send to assess this, for example? Or it could be a very, direct, this is what's happening and this needs to be addressed. So depending on the incident itself, the receiving end will have to take the right steps necessary because we don't want to scare people and make them too concerned about these things, right? There was
Right.
kind of a conversation about maybe it's best if we send a social worker just to say that they're doing a regular check-in, for example,
Hmm.
about a person, or if they're connected to a local organization in the community it could be almost like an invitation for the older person to go to that organization. And then in that organization, a kind of a confidential conversation could be had about what their situation looks like. Um, and so, there are various ways to be able to overcome this. I think the most important step, like you said, Melissa, is to build up the courage to be able to talk about these things. And those things come gradually based on the level of trust this person has with the other side or with the entity that they're reporting this to. And so, trust is a key factor in trauma informed care. And so, if we don't have that trustworthiness, then, a lot of things will be a bit more challenging.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so delicate, right? I mean, it's you never want to accuse someone, but also want to arm yourselves with resources to ensure that this can't happen or shouldn't continue to happen. Very challenging. Even as a healthcare professional, I know that I've dealt with situations, in my career where we've had to report people for one reason or another. And it's a very difficult process. It's a very emotional process. And yeah, it's very challenging. It takes a lot of courage for sure.
Absolutely. And it like you said, it takes courage from the also the person who's reporting it,
Yeah.
especially if it's a healthcare professional in which, you do want to do the best for the person that you're looking after, but you also sometimes may be doubting whether or not this is the right step to do
Yeah.
right now in the moment. And so having if you are a person who's reporting this or is concerned about whether or not you should report it, having someone that you trust and confide with
Hmm.
in which you can maybe have a very private conversation about what are the steps if this were the case, or a scenario that we can hypothetically talk about, but also training for the staff members to be able to identify these things and according to whatever entity that person, healthcare professional, reports to, what are the steps necessary to follow if you felt that there was something that is of concern, and who do you report to, and how do you have those conversations? I think that's super important. So you're not just, having your person, the healthcare professional, be well equipped to handle these things. It's also, how to handle the aftermath of that, to not
Hmm.
have that sense of guilt or that concern that did I
Hmm.
do the
Yeah, building a community not just around the senior, but also around those people that are supporting that senior, whether it be, a outside healthcare professional or the family and the extended family and otherwise. Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is about support and how how to help everyone navigate this because yeah, I mean, I can see it ripping holes in families, which may be to the detriment, right, of that senior. So, what does it all look like? That big picture is really gray and icky. Yeah.
And yeah, and it can be the main factor that really is of concern for the older person too, is what is that going to do to us
Hmm.
as a family, and how is that going to reflect on the future of the older person, right? Because I mean, at
Hmm.
the end of the day, even when we're talking about the mistreatment of older people, why are we having these conversations and why are we providing support for older peoples?
Right.
Because we believe that all people deserve to live with dignity and respect. All people deserve to live a quality of life that is one that they want to live and the way they want to live it. And how can we support communities to do that the best way possible? How can we provide them with enough support and information as to how to do that? And so
Hmm.
it's again, that's more of a strength-based approach, really. Like I said, it's rather than you wagging your finger at communities or people and saying you're not doing the best for your older person, is what is it that you need from us in order for you to do the best for your older person?
Yes.
So kind of switch the way that we have these conversations, I think is super important because you don't want people to be defensive.
Yeah. Which is a natural reaction, really. Whether
Yeah.
it's legit or not, it's a definitely a natural reaction.
I imagine myself, how would I feel if someone's coming
Yeah.
up to me saying, Rose, you're not doing the best for your parent, or you're not treating them well? Yeah, I will be
Yeah.
on the because you don't know me and you don't know what I'm going through or what happened, and all those factors, I think. And that's why it's like you said, it is complex. You have to tread with compassion and empathy and an open mind. and a willingness to understand and listen.
Yeah, and not going into relationships with the fear of what you might find out, right? Really going in ready to talk about anything and getting to build that trusting relationship so that we can have those candid conversations. And I think that spans from, family members having those conversations, seniors being able to have those conversations with whoever is involved, right? Ask the questions and not be afraid to have that difficult discussion.
Yeah, and it's, when we're talking about people who don't speak English as a main language, for example, I think that adds a layer of complexity because they might want to speak up and they might want to express and voice their concerns or opinions and thoughts, right? But if the person who's coming in, and I'm not talking necessarily about family members, let's say people from healthcare professionals who are coming in from the outside in, building that gradual trust is very important, but also being culturally attuned to some of the differences that could play a role in the person acting in a particular way. Like I said, not assuming that just because the older person reverts to their adult child for responding to the conversation, that may not necessarily always mean that the older adult is afraid. It could be that the
Mhm.
older person is embarrassed because they don't know English well or may feel uncomfortable expressing themselves. And so the adult child is going to act as their interpreter in that instance. So I don't necessarily see that as always red flags. I just need to make sure that people know that, there are other things that we need to be mindful of before we kind of jump into conclusion that there's something that needs to be, looked into immediately.
Yeah. I didn't mean to glaze over it because I think you talked about a really important topic, ageism, and that we want every person to be able to age with dignity, with respect, and in the way that they want. But you speak quite extensively about ageism. Can you tell how that relates to it?
Yes. Thank you so much for asking that question. And yes, I don't think I kind of addressed it as much as I wanted to, but I refer to ageism and elder abuse as two faces to the same coin. And the reason behind that is because what ageism loosely is when we discriminate toward a group of people because of their age, whether they're young, they don't know enough, they're old, they're not updated and they're not good enough anymore. And so what ageism does, Melissa, is it creates this issue that when we disrespect and devalue people because of how old they are, usually older adults, then we turn a blind eye to what's happening to them. And that is a huge, huge concern that we should really be very mindful of. We are all growing older. We, right now, our future selves will be the older selves. And so I think it's very important to be mindful of, when a society stops seeing older people as valuable, we stop
Mhm.
caring about what's happening to them. We you look at, I don't want to generalize again, I'm trying to not, but it becomes easier for things to be unnoticed. It becomes easier for you to say, well, yeah, they're old. That's why they don't want to go out. That's why they're isolated, that they don't want to leave their room because they're old, right? But it could be other reasons. Oh, they're forgetting. That comes with age. They're depressed. That comes with age. All these are actually incorrect information. Depression is not a normal sign of aging. Memory loss is not a normal sign of aging.
Mhm.
There are people who, as they grow older, don't want to mix and mingle too much with people. But when you see the older person's way of life changing dramatically in a way that really is not the norm for them, that is a sign that there's something a bit off about them. If you
Mhm.
look at the resources and supports for younger people, they're far more vibrant and exciting than the resources and support and programs and training for older people. I mean, so we think about, the value that we're putting onto an older person. If a 90-year-old person passes away, they lived a good life. If a
Mhm.
young person passes away, oh, they were too young to die, right? And so I think our issue really in society is that old people equal less value than young people. And when that happens, it doesn't matter what happens to old people. They've
Mhm.
lived life, they've used our resources enough, they've drained us enough. Let's focus on the younger generation. And you think about COVID, for example, COVID-19, resources and supports in the healthcare system were scarce. They did
Mhm.
not sometimes go to an older person as a result of their life expectancy being lower than a young person, for example. And it happened in New York, it happened in Italy, for example, in various parts of the country where the value of older people equaled whether or not they were going to access health supports and resources to prolong their lives.
Yeah, age became a scapegoat every day, right? It becomes the excuse for not providing services or care or necessities because they're old and that's why it's happening. Or, yeah, I think it's so unfortunate. But, that's why there's people like you out there that are strongly advocating for getting the word out and, helping people in all realms of community understand and appreciate what this looks like and how to broach some of these really challenging conversations. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. That might sound cliche, but I do always kind of emphasize that, having value and having dignity and living meaningful and purposeful lives really has no expiry date. Just because you're 80 or you're 90 or even a centenarian, if you get to live, you're lucky to live that long, that doesn't, automatically mean that your life needs to be any less than or any less deserving than any person who's younger. And I think the more we kind of promote that way of thinking, hopefully when we get to that age, maybe life would be a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place for us to pause here and I say pause because I would love to continue the conversation and continue chatting with you about education, that cultural sensitivity and humility, how we can us as a home care provider who services the community as caregivers and how we can be better in our role in recognizing this. I think it's very important. So I would love to chat with you again. But just before we end off, any final words that you'd like to share with anyone listening to this or who's maybe experiencing this or is just looking for more information?
Yeah, I think, like I said, the hope is that you'll be able to provide the resources and supports. There is help out there. No one should
Hmm.
experience abuse or mistreatment, and no one should be afraid of talking about it if they feel that they need to. So there's definitely help, and the help is compassionate and hopefully helpful too. But I also kind of wanted to highlight that protecting older people isn't just about responding to older adult mistreatment or abuse. It's really about preserving the dignity and the
Hmm.
respect and value of people in general, but older people in particular, who have lived a life that has probably been challenging and not easy as well. And so it's really important for us to, yes, talk about this in ways that are very compassionate and respectful, but to talk about it and not to be
Hmm.
afraid of having these conversations, because there is support and help out there, and everyone deserves to live a life where they feel like they belong throughout their aging years.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think as professionals to approach the topic with vulnerability and say, like, I am not experienced in every culture and what these dynamics within your family look like. Can you share with me what your family dynamic looks like, how that relates to your culture? And not being afraid to ask the questions and build that trusting relationship through vulnerability and asking questions.
And I think, yes, and what you said was actually perfect, because it made me think about one of the important components. So, I kind of talked about, but probably missed mentioning, which is building that trust will come gradually. It's not going to be, this is my role and, you got to trust me and open up. It's a very gradual building of trust. It could take a bit of time, but the fruit at the end is definitely worth it. And it could come in ways where you're asking in very sensitive and respectful ways, such as, what kind of food do you like to cook back home? And what's the best cultural dish that you enjoy doing? When was the last time you did it? When was the last time you tasted it? And that could be a kind of subtle indicator as to whether or not this person is being provided, for example, with the nutritions that they need or the things that they really enjoy in life. And so those questions come across as curious, but they come across as really wanting to learn more about your culture, and not
Hmm.
in the disrespectful ways where you're saying, are you being fed enough or things like that? Because that could cause the older person to kind of pause and worry about whether or not confiding is going to be the best move. So I think also, like you said, putting your detective hat and finding ways to ask questions in curious ways, but in very respectful ways too, to get more
Yeah.
information.
Absolutely. And trust is so powerful, right? And not abusing that trust or misusing that trust in itself. Knowing that as someone, a health professional or otherwise, we come into these relationships with a certain power dynamic and an innate trust, and to really value that. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for meeting with us today, talking about a really sensitive topic, but appreciate your openness and wanting to talk about it, advocating for these people. I love it. And again, I would love to have you back and continue to dive deeper into this conversation. But thank you so much for being here, for taking time, for all of your advocacy, and just for getting the word out. I think it's amazing. And to everyone that's listening today, please check out all the resources that are posted on the podcast. And I thank you very much for listening and just taking a look at your community and seeing who you can support.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye, all.